realized that that's what was happening, was that they built their website in a way where people were using their own credit cards to steal stuff.
Yeah.
And right, obviously would never connect that back to a customer, right? But like, these are real things. And like, when I said to them, because they were like, well, let me get this right, someone stole a credit card. I said, no, they're using their own. They're not actually even breaking the law technically.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, if the only feedback that you have is reason codes, then it's obvious that, you know, like it's very easy for people to get the impression, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's one of the reasons I'm going to talk about it a little bit in the webinar, but if you want, I hit record, so we can start from here.
Sure.
Because I thought it was an interesting conversation that we were having. We'll just do brief introductions. My name is Jared Wright. I'm the head of marketing for Chargebacks911. This is Zach Matthews.
Yeah,
I get that right?
Zach Matthews. I oversee what we call solutions engineering, which is our customer-facing technology arm. So making sure that our technology can achieve the outcomes that our customers want.
Cool. And we just talked a little bit, but now that we're kind of recording, so you have a history before Chargebacks911. You were on the fraud prevention side for in the gaming industry. Am I right?
Yeah. So my background largely has been using analytics to study and then prevent fraud. And that's really what I do now, just on the vendor side of things. But I think what we were talking about is really this idea that a lot of merchants don't understand. By not fighting fraud, you're inviting it. We live in a world where savvy fraudsters know what to look for. You can go out on Reddit and they'll communicate to each other and announce stuff that's going on. And so both anecdotally and quantitatively, not fighting fraud invites more fraud because people find that you're vulnerable and they go after you. And ultimately, what's really cool about that is that's usually first-party fraud, which is the type of fraud that we actually have very, very high success rates in fighting.
Yeah. Well, so let's do that here, because I think a lot of times when people say fight fraud, or when they say fraud, they always mean third-party fraud. Yep. And you and I are so steeped in chargebacks that, you know, we interpret it a little bit different. So let's dive into that real quick before the webinar starts. And just so everybody knows, this is kind of a new format that we're doing. If you're listening to me talk now, and this what we're about to do is we're about to record a webinar about the Chargeback field report, and then we're going to have some additional features. So we're going to answer additional questions and have additional conversation before and after the webinar. We're going to include clips from the webinar, so you get some of it, but it's not going to be the entire webinar. But you know, I figured if I got Zach on webcam, we might as well have a conversation and sort of produce that, or make that content available. So that's what we're doing right now. It's sort of like a video podcast. But the first party versus third party fraud. Can we dive into that real quick, just as a good primer for the conversation today?
Yeah, absolutely. So at its most basic level, first party fraud is that I'm using my own stuff to defraud a merchant. So right, I'm effectively leveraging, either intentionally or unintentionally, some part of the chargeback process, and that amounts to me filing an invalid chargeback. Yeah. In the case of chargeback first party fraud.
Okay. And it's also called first party misuse, which is, I think, a little bit, people get a little less reactionary, right? Because it includes a lot of different things that aren't traditionally what you would consider fraud, right? It's a lot of accidental, it's a lot of not understanding the implications of a button on your app. There's a lot of different reasons that it happens. So yeah, first party misuse or first party fraud, it is a type of fraud ultimately, though.
To that point, the way that I like to talk about it is you've got first party misuse, and then some portion of that is first party fraud, right? And that can be different for different merchants. So to your point, if bad descriptors or a bad website are contributing to customers mistakenly filing a chargeback, that's first party misuse, right? That's not intentional. It's actually, in some cases, the result of the merchant's design versus the customer's behavior. And then within that, there is indeed a classification that I like to focus on, which is first party fraud, which is there are people on this planet that intentionally look for the loopholes, and they even talk about them online, right? There's both anecdotal and quantitative proof that says that if you don't fight fraud, these folks that are intentionally committing first-party fraud will find what's going on, and they'll even share that information with other people that are doing the same stuff.
Yeah, that's true. So what's it like living in Vegas?
So
to kind of, you know, I've always wondered. You and I have had a lot of conversations, but I think you're the only person that I know that's. Have you lived in Vegas a long time, or did you move there for the job?
10.5 years now. So a lot longer than I ever thought I was going to. I said 2 years tops when I moved.
Yeah. So do you like it? Where did you move from?
I do like it. So I was originally born and raised in Wisconsin, went to school out east in Baltimore, and then after college was kind of a nomad. Worked in consulting, lived in Japan, lived in Singapore, was kind of all over. And Vegas was really the first place that I've called home other than the childhood house that I grew up in.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you like, you know, it's, the Vegas that I see is probably very different than the Vegas that you interact with. So for people that, you know, maybe have gone for the weekend or gone for a week or whatever for a bachelorette party or something like that, and they have a very solid sense of what Vegas is. Like, what would you say the biggest surprise is for people that for those people? You know, how do you see Vegas differently than the normal tourist?
So this is a great anecdote, actually. Most people that visit Las Vegas have never set foot in the city of Las Vegas. The original Las Vegas Strip is Fremont Street, which is downtown. And what happened in the late 70s was the casino moguls got into a fight with the city of Las Vegas for levying a gaming tax. And they moved the Strip to Paradise, Nevada, built a new airport, moved the Welcome to Las Vegas sign. So most people that have come to Las Vegas have only ever been to Paradise, Nevada, and never set foot in Las Vegas itself.
Really? So downtown is Las, because downtown's the one with the roof, right?
Correct.
Like outside, but inside somehow?
Correct. That's the original Las Vegas Strip. The Golden Nugget and all of the old Las Vegas casinos were down there. And so if you go down there, there's a bunch of hidden culture. There's a mob museum. There's what's called the Neon Graveyard, where they have over 200 years of neon that have been taken off of casinos, where they still have it lit up instead of destroying it. And so Vegas has a less adult playground side to it that I like to point people to. And that's what I would call downtown, or what's called the Arts District.
That's cool. And so do you go to, like, I imagine there's entertainment all the time. There's electronic music, live music. Like, do you take advantage of that, or is it just sort of background noise, like, you know?
Literally was just on the show or on the Strip last night and saw Matt Apple. So I have, after living here as long as I have friends that are performers, and so I usually see a couple shows a month. And then that's actually the best part of living in Vegas. If you like concerts but you don't want to commit to spending the money, I just saw Pink 2 weeks ago for $31, because you can pick up dirt cheap tickets the day of if you just don't care whether you go or not.
Or 5 minutes after the show starts is another secret.
Literally, and so I've seen all kinds of amazing performances for dirt cheap because of that, and so it's kind of fun, that aspect of it, for sure.
Yeah, that's one of the things with Florida, is it's because of where it's located. A lot of tours never come down here because they've got to drive everything down, and they got to drive everything back up. Whereas almost everywhere else in the country, it's like you just kind of go through and you're on to somewhere else. So we get the big acts and stuff, but we don't get as much of the smaller stuff. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead. So just so everybody listening, we're gonna go ahead and start a webinar right now. I think Mark from Edgar Dunn is gonna join us. We're gonna go over some of the key stats from the Chargeback field report. That will be, we'll include clips from that, sort of the greatest hits, just so everybody has a reference of what we talked about. And then Zach and I, and hopefully Mark, are gonna pick up after the webinar, and we're gonna answer a lot of the questions that were submitted by the people that registered for the webinar. And we're gonna have sort of an extended Q&A. We're gonna continue the conversation, probably less about Vegas, but we're gonna answer a lot of the questions, and hopefully it'll be something interesting for everybody. Also, Mark just jumped on, so thank you, Mark, for joining us. I'm gonna go ahead and change the presentation. So it's got me, Zach, and Mark. So thank you, Zach, and thank you, Mark. I'm glad you could make it to kind of go over these stats today. Mark worked really closely with us in crafting the study and some of the analysis, so I'm glad that you could make it.
And apologies for being very late.
No, it's great. We're happy that you could be here. Yeah. All right. we're going to go ahead and get started. So just sort of a spiel that I like to give. I've given this in the past, but it's something that I think is important that we discuss. This study is primarily based on survey responses from nearly 300 merchants that we spoke to. We asked them a bunch of different questions, and then we aggregated, and we're publishing those results. This is one way to look at data. And when I talk about data, I like to use an allegory from India where it imagines blind people filling an elephant and how each person would describe the elephant different depending on how they were, what part of the elephant that they were touching. A lot of times data, especially data for something as complicated and taboo as chargebacks, is very, very difficult to understand. And so if you are only looking at data, so if you're only looking at aggregate data from, large payment processors or the card schemes versus, data from the cardholder's perspective or data from the merchant perspective, you're going to get a slightly different variation of reality. And I advocate, taking today's stats and the stats in the field report, and then understanding them as part of a larger picture when you talk about chargebacks and fraud. I know that in a lot of places, the language started evolving where chargeback was being phased out and people were starting to use dispute, but we've been asking this question since 2021. I think we asked it in 2022. I don't know if we asked it in 2020 or not, but at least since 2021, and we've been tracking the popularity of the term chargeback versus the popularity of the term dispute. And I was very happy to find that chargeback is still going strong. We were unable to acquire disputes911.com. so we're kind of stuck with chargeback. So I'm happy for that reason. But Mark, is that like, you have a lot of conversations with people all the way up the chain. Is there are banks more likely to like the term dispute, or is everybody like, what is your feeling on it? Have you noticed a trend anywhere with the language?
Yeah, it's a good question. I like that, you've got it in there. I think it's a shame you can't have disputes 911 because it will cover both bases. I think, maybe I'm wrong in thinking this, but chargebacks are associated with cards. Whether it's Visa or Visa, Amex, Diners, whatever, it is associated with cards, a card
Right.
payment. But actually, in reality, and we've seen in the previous slide, there's a lot of alternative forms of payment. And those alternative forms of payment, particularly real-time payments, the expectation for real-time payments in the future, more bank transfers, more real-time payments, will also have issues. Well, that's another way of saying disputes, scams, APP fraud, authorized push payment fraud. And I think that's probably the language around that is more likely to be disputes, but that's, my opinion, and that's a very global opinion, thinking about beyond cards.
We did and we've been calling this the chargeback spectrum, but really it's the friendly fraud spectrum. And what we did is we asked merchants, and then we asked consumers on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being appropriate, right? So it's appropriate that the cardholder contacted their bank, and then a 0 being entirely inappropriate. So that means it's like a malicious form of friendly fraud. And all of the examples that we gave are technically they're first party misuse, but they're obviously different scenarios and different things. And so the interesting thing for me is to compare where merchants are with their assessment of how appropriate it is and where consumers are. And I think it's the punchline for me is that merchants and consumers are a lot closer than we would think. So let's go through kind of like lightning round style, and then I'll read the scenario, and then you guys tell me on a scale of 1 to 10 how appropriate you think it is, and then we'll see if you guys are siding more with the merchants or the consumers. Okay, first one is Christy purchases an outfit online. The estimated shipping is 7 business days, but after 2 weeks, the item still has not arrived. She has not received any communication from the seller. She tries to inquire about her purchase, but gives up after being left on hold for 10 minutes. Frustrated, she contacts her bank. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, Zach, 10 being completely appropriate, 0 being completely inappropriate, where does this one fall?
4.
4? How about you, Mark?
I'm giving it a 7.
7, okay, yeah. Oh, so 7, so appropriate.
Yeah.
All right.
Appropriate that she calls the bank.
Okay. All right. So Mark is you're empathizing obviously more with the card holder, and Zach, you're empathizing more. And I mean, this is interesting. We probably should have done this the whole time because I think this is super interesting because there's different things that are happening here. The merchant should have obviously communicated if there was a shipping delay, right? The merchant should have been available and not left the purchaser on hold for 10 minutes. But that still doesn't mean that they can contact their bank and try to get their money back, right? Because in all likelihood, they're going to receive their order in 2 days. They're going to have their money back and the product.
Questions I would ask, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did they receive a confirmation email? Does not received any communication mean, right, like you didn't get an order status or a number that you can check? Do they have those things available online, right? It's nuanced. And I think that's
for sure.
But the process that adjudicates on this is not nuanced. And so that's why, right, like as merchants pay the price for that because it's always going to default on the side of the cardholder. And so to your point, I think that's why you see it at a 5 or a 6.
All right, so let's do another one. Okay, Sarah lets her young child play games unsupervised on her phone. Her kid spends almost $100 in-game purchases. She contacts her bank and says she did not authorize the charges. She does not mention her child. All right. Scale of 1 to 10, Zach, what do you got?
1.
1.
Okay, both super inappropriate, right?
Yeah.
This one is weird because this one was a pretty big gap between the card holders, one of the larger gaps, and I think it's for the reason that everybody's saying here. Obviously, she shouldn't have contacted her, but but I think like I have small kids, right? Like it's something that you empathize with, right? You don't want your kid to go and make or your teenager is probably a cleaner one, right? Your teenager, you put your credit card in Roblox. And your older child buys a bunch of Robux and goes crazy, that's on you, right? Like it's calling and saying that this is unauthorized is basically synonymous with saying that, somebody stole my credit card number. I didn't make these transactions. So technically it's unauthorized, but are you going to report your child to the police? Go ahead, Zach. What do you got?
Fun fact, though, it's becoming more common with digital-only goods companies to have a remediation strategy in place for this, meaning that if you contact Epic Games or Riot Games and that's happened, they'll actually look at it and refund that back and take the purchase away because in that situation they can reclaim their good, right?
Yeah.
It's different when it's a physical product and those types of things. So I think, again, my challenge with this is by not contacting the merchant, going straight to the bank, you've effectively created one outcome for the merchant, which is that they get a chargeback.
Yeah, well, I think with all of these, right? like the punchline with all of these is contact the merchant before, Yeah. Okay, so let's do one more, and then we'll get to a few questions. Andrew sees an offer to try a new product for free. He enters his credit card to pay shipping without realizing he's also agreeing to be billed automatically. The terms were technically listed on the checkout page, but they were small and located at the very bottom. Andrew feels duped and angrily calls his bank. Appropriate or inappropriate?
Inappropriate.
So I'd actually put like a 5.5 or a 6 on this.
I'm saying 4, 3.5, 4.
Look at that. Yeah. So merchants think it's inappropriate, right? And again, this is all every time we talk about one of these, right, there's like 16 follow-up questions. Like, wait a minute, how far down, like, was it, is it,
it's below the checkout,
what's the person's
technically
name?
that's invalid, right? Because they can get to the checkout button without having to view it. It has to be required to view it to get to the checkout button.
Oh, okay, you're right. Okay, so then there you go. That is nuanced. You're right. You're right. We'll have to make that adjustment if we ask this question again.
That's also most merchants ought to give the consumer a cooling off period, 30 days or something like that, just to allow them to realize that it's an automatic billing, maybe a notification to say, you subscribe to this, you've got this period of time to cancel it. I think most merchants do.
Yeah, I think they do. In fact, most merchants, I know that for a long time we were consulting, or I was having conversations with different people on webinars and talking to merchants, and it was always that like do you notify the cardholder before you do the automatic billing, right? Like, I'm not even saying in the free trial context, but I'm saying in the like subscription, you're paying for this software, you're using it every month. And I'm starting to get, at least in my inbox, a lot of pre-charge notifications for the subscriptions that I have, right? My Hulu, we're going to charge your card again, just making sure like that type of thing. And I think it's because of the chargeback issue. It's just easier to deal with churn than it is to deal with people that are like, oh, I meant to cancel, and then they contact their bank. Because then you've got, first of all, they have the ability, depending on depending on who their issuer is, they have the ability to like dispute 6 transactions, right? 6 months worth or whatever it is for a transaction. So it's not even just that one transaction. You're creating risk for all of the transactions. Whereas if you would have just reminded them so that they could cancel, so it's interesting. But
another similar example is where the consumer's given a free trial, 30 days free trial, and then at the 31st day, the billing kicks in on a monthly basis.
Yeah.
And I think, quite a lot of people forget to cancel the trial.
Well, that's why they give you the free trial, right? That's their hope, is that you're going to forget.
But
I know that
every
time I do it, I'll free trial. Okay, just remember. I don't know. I think the punchline here is that with all of these different situations, there's nuance that it's very easy to sympathize with, right? Like we're all merchants or cardholders or merchants, and the people at the banks are also people that shop online, and so there's a very human element to it that I think when people talk about first party misuse or friendly fraud, or they speak in broad strokes, they don't include a lot of the nuance and a lot of the like human part of it. If you only take the extreme examples of whatever, a really shady merchant or a really shady cardholder, then you get I just don't think it's helpful, and it doesn't really map onto a lot of business, a lot of experience of merchants. All right, so let's just go through a few questions here. These are big questions. So the first one is, Franco asked how to avoid chargebacks, and there was actually, I just used Franco's because it was short, but there was a lot of people that asked questions, right? So if what you're trying to do is reduce chargebacks, there's a lot of different things, but let's just do rapid fire. Zach, what is your #1 tip for reducing chargebacks?
I think addressing them holistically and thinking of them from a dispute strategy perspective. We've talked about that throughout the rest of the conversation, and I don't need to wax poetic.
Yeah. All right, Mark, what is the biggest tip that you can give to merchants that are looking to reduce chargebacks?
Yeah, it depends where they're experiencing the most. So if it's online, there's got to be, better, strong customer authentication, for example, is very, very helpful for merchants if they're supporting it. But the problem is they can support it, but then the issuing bank may not be supporting it. So there's complications around 3D Secure. There's a solution for. I mean, it's very, very difficult to answer that question. I think it's it's a good question, but it's so many.
Sorry for putting you on the spot with a big one. Yeah, just give me a soundbite. Yeah, it's true. I think just selfishly, I'm going to say, look, if what you're trying to do is reduce chargebacks, what you can do is you can just contact Chargebacks911. We could set you up with a variety of tools that essentially how they work is they intercept the chargeback in a pre-chargeback right between the dispute and the chargeback, and they allow you to resolve the dispute without dealing with the chargeback. It's sort of like a P2P type of thing, but with disputes. How can organizations better defend themselves against fraud? Zach, you've got a lot of experience in this. What's a thing overlooked secret that we can give people?
So I don't think it's an overlooked secret, but I think it bears being said. So use the data and make sure that you're being data driven and looking at actual numbers, but look for things like bias. So whatever problem led you there, assume that there's another problem. So again, from a comprehensive perspective with fraud, I think you need to kind of look at what you have happening and then step into what's driving it versus looking at what's there and jumping straight to an outcome. So to use a metaphor, don't treat it don't go to a doctor that says, hey, you have a cold, here are some decongestants. Go to a doctor that says, hey, why are you coughing? And starts to break things down and figures out how to treat the underlying cause versus the individual symptoms. And I think that that's the difference between a good fraud strategy that is hard to beat, is addressing the underlying symptoms, the leakage, the underlying causes, not the symptoms, versus a bad fraud strategy, which is just going at, hey, I'm getting hit over here and being responsive. Because at the end of the day, we live in an environment now where there's enough first-party fraud that trends tend to circle around what we're doing. So being proactive ultimately is the only way.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, we're getting a little bit close to the top of the hour. So Zach and I are going to continue to answer these questions, but we're going to release that conversation as the podcast in 1 week. Mark, you think you can hang out for another 10, 15 minutes and answer some questions off the record?
Happy to.
All right. Okay. The next question is from Michelle. She said, does RDR count as a chargeback? And we talked about this, but Zach, you have details on this. What do you tell Michelle, who's a little bit confused?
Yeah, so officially, according to the networks, and that's really what matters, the answer is no, RDR does not count as a chargeback. However, there are some acquirers that do not properly interpret RDR hits and include it in their reporting of chargebacks, which can create confusion when your acquirer reports your chargeback level differently than you would be seen at like VMPI with Visa. But the short answer.
So the answer is it depends, right?
Correct.
Now, is this specific to RDR? Is this like CDRN and stuff like that? This happens as well?
No, this is specific for RDR, and it's the reason is a technical underpinned reason that I don't need to get super into, but because of the way that RDR leverages the same vehicle, essentially the same rails as an actual chargeback, it can look that way for people that haven't looked at, right? Like there's essentially two flags. And so since RDR refunds are pushed through the same pipe as a chargeback, it can look like a chargeback to people that don't know what to look for.
Okay. All right. So the next question that we have is from Daniel, who wants to know about winning a dispute, but we're going to come back to that one, I think. Are new alternative payments impacting fraud? This is something that we talked about, I know, during the webinar, but Mark, you had some, like, this is a kind of a world that you live in, I think, a little bit, is the concern that was demonstrated in our study, where, just as a reminder, 60% of merchants said that alternative payments had a higher fraud risk. Is that just because they're new? or you know, is there some that are dangerous, and what are the ones that merchants should feel confident in offering their consumers?
Yeah,
I was asking you. I was throwing that to you, Mark.
Yeah, and I'm thinking how to answer it, because alternative forms of payment are, you know, if you're including Apple Pay and Google Pay in that bucket of alternative forms of payment, and so arguably they are container wallets. They're a container for a Visa or MasterCard. So the dispute process or the chargeback process is the same. So I'm kind of surprised that the statistics are telling us that actually there's concern that actually, I think you said 60% of merchants are more concerned about fraudulent activity and chargebacks related to alternative forms of payments, because I think, you know, where the majority of them were mobile wallets, you know, using a Visa and MasterCard, they shouldn't be more fraudulent or more chargebacks associated with that, because it's usually strong customer authentication. It's SCA protected, so to speak. So the liability has been shifted to the issuer. Your consumer has either fingerprinted or facial recognized the mobile payment, and it should be secure end to end. It should be no problems. Now, maybe the statistics are referring to bank transfers or alternative forms of payment where there isn't a proper chargeback process.
Right.
And therefore it's a bit pioneering, it's a bit new world. You know, when you send the money through a bank transfer to the merchant and the goods don't get delivered, and then how do you dispute that? You can't call the bank, because the bank's just going to say, well, you sent the money, it's your fault.
Right.
So I need to phone up the merchant and dispute the transaction, say, hey, the goods weren't delivered, or they were delivered and they were faulty, or I ordered a futon or an IKEA bed, not to name any particular merchant, but you know what I mean. And parts were missing in the construction, so I couldn't finish my bed. So I have to dispute with the merchant. So I think maybe that's what that's referring to. So I don't know.
So officially, can we? I mean, if we just take Google Pay, Apple Pay, the wallet solutions, those are going to be more secure,
I think so,
presumably, than just accepting a credit card.
I think to speak up. So we're seeing from an evidentiary perspective in certain jurisdictions that, right, that type of evidence that traditionally when a cardholder said it's fraud, that was like the magic, it's you win cardholder, right?
Yeah.
But now what we're seeing is that those data points that say, well, hey, hold on, but there was a fingerprint associated with this transaction. Did they steal your finger and your phone too? And the answer is, we're starting to see the bank's light bulbs come on, and they now side with the merchant. And it's happening slowly. It's not global, right? But we are seeing a change from that perspective. And so I would agree, again, for those mobile wallets that have a strong emphasis on know your customer and validating that the human using it is the one that should be, I think that becomes an evidentiary piece. And so then, right, merchants should feel more comfortable accepting those transactions, similar to how 3DS has become the standard in the UK, as an example.
Right.
And so I think.
So is it that the issuer knows that this is a Apple Pay transaction, and so it knows that all of the verification layers are there, or is that information
in some ways
individually passed along to the issuer in a way that it isn't with a normal transaction?
Yes, all of that. Well, so the issuer doesn't always get that, because remember how the issuer is integrated, and that's different for the thousands of players in the universe. And so that's, again, part of the problem, and why working with someone like us as a third-party equalizer, right? Because if they don't recognize the evidence the first time through, our overturns team will get on the phone and point it out with a human. And that's
Right.
one point that I'll make is we do actually win those cases very often in overturn when we have that as an auxiliary data point. And so, no, it's not always pushed to the issuer, but I think the idea is that what Apple and Google and Samsung are going for is a proxy for an EMV chip, right? Allowing you to be able to treat those cards like they're in person because, right, the person that validated it did it on their phone and that terminal was in their hand, it's their phone. And so that's ultimately what they're trying to get to from a standard. It just is happening slowly, is my opinion personally from what I see.
Okay. So the next questions Nick asked, and this is a question, I mean, I think every time we do this or anytime I see a story, there's, like there's so much AI stuff right now. But Nick was asked, so we actually had a bunch of AI questions. This specific one is, what's the best way to leverage AI tools to support better chargeback dispute recoveries? But maybe we can even go a little bit broader. Mark, what is it that, what aspect of AI is exciting you, and what aspect of AI do you feel like is kind of overhyped in its current capacity?
Yeah, I heard a good thing last week about AI. So it's trying to distinguish between machine learning, which you typically see in fraud prevention tools, using mass data to look for patterns and identifying chargebacks or potential fraudulent activity. So that's machine learning, and that's usually seen translated in real world coding and software development, whereas AI is only seen on a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
So maybe, but I mean, having said that, I think there's a couple of things, and depending on who asked the question, was it a merchant or a bank? If a merchant's asking the question, I think a lot of merchants are using AI to help customer service, to have chatbots and trawl lots of information to be able to help the customer with, delivery, disputes, things, queries about the product, whatever. And I think that's helping consumers become more confident about the product and the purchase of the transaction and the delivery and the after sales, which I think is super important, because you want them to deal with the merchant and not just pick up the phone to the bank and say it's a chargeback, because then that's a slippery road down a bit of a problem area.
So AI, is that, I mean, is it like a buzzword, or what excites you about AI?
So
in the short term, I guess. In the long term, they're gonna, we're gonna be asking AI for everything. But
I personally ascribe to the idea that AI will augment human intelligence, not replace it. And right, so there's the Stephen Hawking who thought that we were going to be replaced, and then there's Neil deGrasse Tyson, who thinks that the right way to work with artificial intelligence is to use it for mundane tasks that make you faster, smarter, et cetera, kind of like how we used a calculator for hundreds of years. And so I get excited when I think about it as an assistive technology, because we see all kinds of failures where you just throw artificial intelligence at it, and right, we have a worldwide Microsoft outage that was tied back to that. And so, right, I think at the end of the day, what excites me is the ability to automate and do small tasks much more quickly, so that we can use our critical thinking and reasoning as humans for the bigger problems. Because at the end of the day, you have to train the model. And so, right, if you train the model on your data, this is the second point I want to make. Merchants are at a disadvantage. They have a smaller data set. And so, right, it's the idea that merchants are ultimately at a disadvantage when they engage with the technology, but we kind of fulfill that similar place. And so I get excited about this from a personal perspective, because we have a ton of data. We get to see it from an FI perspective. We get to see it from a merchant perspective. And ultimately, as an assistive technology, it's another data point that you use to make intelligent decisions, not something that you set and forget.
Right. Yeah, no, I think so too. I think just off the top of my head, the area where it has a lot of promise, specifically as pertaining to chargebacks, is the summarizing of data, right? just like how you can say, hey, you can ask ChatGPT a question, it'll go through and kind of give you a boring sort of summary. I think that AI obviously has a use in that collecting of data, collecting transaction history, collecting, doing a lot of tedious work, connecting to different systems that used to take somebody a couple of hours to go through, say, okay, let me look at their customer service thing, let me read all the notes, let me look at their usage logs, let me check their IP, match that to the, you know what I mean? All of those processes, and sort of allowing an AI agent to summarize that and make that accessible and something that you can interact with, I think is going to be one of the areas where you're going to have a lot of potential.
And to that point, right, I think when we talk about, because customers will ask us, how do we use these technologies ourselves, right? To tie into that, that's exactly what we're doing internally, right? AI isn't making decisions. AI is going and grabbing data and providing auxiliary data points, right, to be able to build and profile from a right demographic perspective, so that you can have a broader view of things and then pull those data points into smaller conversations. And so I think it's exactly what you're saying, but I also want to call out, right, as an organization, that's exactly what we do, leveraging that broader span of data that we have from working with the different levels, not just merchants.
So the next question I left in here because it's really seemed like your wheelhouse. It says, Zach, it said, how has the implementation of the new compelling evidence standards affected friendly fraud in online gaming?
Oh, in online gaming specifically.
Yeah, it's a very broad, and then it gets narrower. So we'll talk about the online gaming part, but if you want to broaden it out, I mean, first of all, so the compelling evidence standards, do you want to kind of just make sure that people understand what
standard evidence, or the compelling evidence standards, and the way that I would summarize those changes is that the networks are getting more comprehensive in taking into consideration new age data points. The classic examples that I'll use is right, from a dispute perspective, you have to be able to mail a card holder everything that's evidence. So we can't use recordings, we can't use, right, those types of things. So it gets challenging. So when we start to talk about things like now taking into play, know your customer stuff, digital walleting, biometrics. So right, in gaming, that's a place where know your customer is already required because the government requires it. So what you saw was a disconnect between the information that people had on hand already and the way that it was used as evidence. And we're seeing that gap close, because as evidence, we're starting to recognize and be able to overturn, well, hey, when Mark insists that he wasn't involved in the transaction, but I have him holding a copy of his passport while he's authorizing it, right?
Yeah.
It's coming alive to the idea that, hey, maybe Mark was involved in the transaction, where a year ago, we wouldn't have had a vehicle to submit that evidence and it wouldn't have been considered.
For sure, right. Or you would have, but you would have gone through the normal dispute process and it would have been a really subjective thing, whereas now there's some more concrete rules. Correct. Yeah, that's a true point, because I thought the online gaming was a little bit beside the point, but I guess it does make sense, because really the rules were for businesses that are collecting all of that information in a way that they can use readily, and for businesses with like a history with a customer and other things, so it's not.
But what you see though is there's this natural fight between, do I ask the customer for it and create friction and have the right or not have the information? And so online gaming, or even like dating sites, are starting to do more like human verification of stuff. So like know your customer type things. That type of evidence is now starting to be possible as something you can enter in, where a year, 2 years ago, it wasn't. They were very black and white with what was and what was not. And so I think including more know your customer type stuff is really, really valuable for those businesses that already do a lot of know your customer type activities and don't have to modify their process to get the data.
Yeah, and the technology is getting a lot more seamless. I'm trying to remember what I did. I did something like a loan or something. I forget what it was, but it was like, like turn your head to the left or right or whatever. But it was all in my phone. It was almost easier than typing in information. Definitely easier than remembering what street I grew up on and like all these different things. Mark, is this? I you go to a lot of events and stuff like that there. Is there something that you've seen in the sort of like data space or the identity verification space that's been kind of a game changer that you can think of? Sorry, I know I'm putting you on the spot. You can just tell me no.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. You referred to capturing people as part of their onboarding process, particularly gaming and financial services. There's certain verticals that is necessary to be able to verify your customers, making sure that there's no money laundering, or they're applying to the appropriate rules and regulations within the particular country. So I think you're right. We've seen a lot of technology being applied there. It could be biometrics, it could be photographs of, or you know, verifying a license, even just your driver's license. There's software that can identify that it's not fraudulently, you know, a counterfeit license, because they know, you know, the hologram, the special identification of the type of license, regardless of what country or state. So I think there's a lot of sophisticated software out there doing that type of thing, and I think it's appropriate for those particular verticals. But you know, if you're buying an airline ticket or a sofa from a furniture store, hopefully you don't have to.
I'm wondering if you could tokenize it in some way, though. You know,
well,
because I was surprised by how seamless it was. Like, given that it was, you know, I think you were right. It was like a quick take a photo of your driver's license. So it was a multi-step thing, but it wasn't. Like the interface was really, really smooth and really easy. And so I imagine it's going to get smoother and easier. And I'm wondering if there's I don't know. We're kind of off in the deep end here, but like it seems like this could be something just part of online shopping, right? If it's
technology companies that are doing this.
It's a part of identification, isn't it? It's you as an individual, you know, can you token yourself? You are the individual. It is definitely me, and I've definitely good for the money. You know, if you do some sort of identification like that, and I think that's payment and identification are kind of going hand in hand, particularly when we're moving towards more of a digital environment, more of a digital you know, ecosystem that consumers are going to be working in. And you know, think about the metaverse. You know, how do you identify people in the metaverse, you know, who want to make purchases of NFTs or whatever?
Right.
So yeah, I think that's the way it's going to go. It's interesting you touched on the word token and tokenization. I think network tokens, which is what the schemes are really moving towards, I think that's going to bring a layer of greater protection for both merchants and consumers.
That's great. All right. Well, listen, we've been talking for a while now. Zach and I talked a little bit before the webinar. Marky, thank you for hanging out. Thank you for anybody that listens to this podcast. I appreciate you guys joining us today. Hopefully we were able to provide some interesting information, maybe some helpful information to merchants out there.
And thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate. I know we support the field report. We love reading it, and really appreciate being part of it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to tell you, we had 500. I think it's the most we've ever had for a webinar. The field reports are usually, I think, are probably one of our most popular webinars, but it's almost 600 people registered. So that's like a pretty good chunk of people that are interested in hearing, you know, what kind of information's in there. So thank you, Zach, for joining us today, and thank you, Mark. We'll end it here.